Good day, everyone. My name is Martin Lowery. I am the United States representative to the International Cooperative Alliance, and I'm also the chair of the committee that is responsible for looking at cooperative identity, and therefore opening the program for you today, where we'll be talking about the results of a very comprehensive and very interesting survey regarding cooperative identity that's been conducted globally for the past few months. As you can see on the screen, we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to choose your language. We have English, Spanish, French, and Japanese available. If you go to the drop-down box, you'll be able to identify through interpretation which language that you would like to be listening to the program on. In addition, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers, and you can see on your screen that there is a Q&A box, questions and answers, and please feel free to use that rather than the chat box, and we will be monitoring those questions, and we'll have an opportunity later in the program to address them. So if we could go to the first slide, please. A little bit of background, and I'm sure that most of you who are tuning into the program today are well aware of this, but in 1995, at a very important Congress in Manchester, UK, the final statement on the cooperative identity was approved by the General Assembly. And that includes the definition of a cooperative, the values, and the principles. And the values, as you know, are divided into cooperative values, which are relatively unique to us, and then ethical values as well. So that formed the basis of a, let's say, codified approach to identifying to the world who we are as cooperatives. Now, we can say that goes all the way back into the mid-1800s with Rochdale and the Rochdale Principles, which is true. But then work has been done through the centuries to update those principles. And we've been working with the values and principles as codified in Manchester since 1995. The Congress that was held last December in Seoul, Korea, was intended to open up a dialogue on the meaning and future importance of our cooperative identity. And for those of you that have been there or have read the report, there's a great deal of material that was developed through the Seoul Congress involving various aspects of cooperative identity and its relationship to significant issues that we face in the world today, whether it's looking at a subject as broad as world peace or as specific as the digital economy and its impact on all of us. So that's the point of embarkation for the work that we are now doing in what we're calling cooperative identity consultation. If we go to the next slide, please. So the consultation that we're talking about has a number of specific objectives. First and foremost is the statement on the cooperative identity fit for purpose today. Does it mean what it needs to mean in terms of our ability to address not only our identity, but its impact on the world? Secondly, we want to enhance all of our understanding on the identity and increase its strategic value. The survey itself is going to be very important in terms of the results that we see on that particular point. Also, we want to identify actions that the ICA can take to refresh, deepen, and protect the cooperative identity. In this regard, as chair of the Cooperative Identity Committee of the board, I want to thank the Cooperative Identity Advisory Group members and the staff for the great work that's been done so far, and in anticipation of the work that will be done in the coming months. Speaking as a board member and as a committee member, we can't do it without you. It's really important to have membership input and guidance as we look at directions that we may take to refresh, deepen, and protect the cooperative identity. So we're really relying on that input from all of you to make the right kinds of decisions for the future. And finally, stimulating cooperatives to take actions consistent with our cooperative identity to address problems facing the world today. That is an enormous task, enormous. And I think that all of us can imagine the point at which the actions that cooperatives take globally can have a very direct impact on the problems we face today around the world. That's where our commonality comes into play, because we need to be able to work with one another, talk with one another, think particularly about principle number 6, cooperation among cooperatives, and think about the global impact that we can have in working together. So there's quite a bit of work to be done in the consultation process. And the survey is the next phase beyond the Seoul Congress that's going to be very important to address. Next slide, please. So the consultation includes the work that was done in the Congress, the survey that we'll be talking about today. By the way, let me make sure our expectations are all together on this. This is a first look at the survey. There's going to be a lot of analysis that needs to be done. It's an incredibly comprehensive survey, as you'll see as we get into the details. So we're going to be doing primarily an overview today, but very anxious to hear your comments and the comments of the panelists later on what this can mean to our future. We are collecting and reviewing existing materials on cooperative identity, some of which is still available or now available on the website, ICA.coop. We're looking at the development of educational webinars, an online discussion forum, virtual consultation sessions. The advisory group takes all of that in its deliberations in terms of recommendations that it will be making to the ICA board. And then, of course, ultimately, if there are actions to be taken, that's where the General Assemblies come in 2023 and 2024, so that the membership has a maximal voice in these discussions. Next slide, please. So I will turn this over now to Alexandra Wilson, who is the chair of the Cooperative Identity Advisory Group. And she will guide us through an overview of the survey. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we have today and the potential it has for moving us forward with great momentum on this very exciting effort. Alexandra Wilson.
Thank you, Martin. I'll be sharing this presentation with Hung-Sik who is the Director of Research on the staff of the ICA. So if you can move to the next slide, I'll start off. All right, so the survey was conducted over a several-month period ending October 31st with the help of volunteers in different member organizations of the ICA. We were able to make the survey available in 11 different languages. And you can see here on this pie chart the distribution of responses across the different language groups. Next slide, please. In all, we had 2,290 complete responses to the survey. 136 different countries participated. You can see on this pie chart the distribution of the 2,290 responses across the 4 regions of the ICA. Next slide. There were 3 different versions of the survey, each targeting a different group of respondents. There was a common part that everybody answered, and then there were separate questions for organizational respondents, individual cooperators, and experts in the field of cooperatives. So you can see what the distribution of participants was. 27% on behalf, completing the survey on behalf of an organization, 42% answering as individual cooperators, and 31% answering as experts. Next slide. Hung-Sik. Are you with us, Hung-Sik? Yeah, good.
Okay, so let's see who responded this survey. So as Alexandra explained, we had three different questionnaires. So one questionnaire for the organizations, not person. So from the 622 organizations, we got answers, and including 141 ICA direct members, and also more than 300 cooperatives, which are member of ICA members. So majority of the organization respondents are from ICA or the member of ICA members. Next slide, please. In terms of cooperative types, as you can see, we have very balanced share of the different type of cooperatives, like from the personal cooperatives, means agriculture, fishery, also the enterprise cooperatives, to financial and consumer housing and worker cooperatives. Also, we have quite important number of the federation organizations, also some non-cooperatives association or government organization as well who answered the survey. Next slide. In terms of individual persons, we had two different questionnaires, one for individual cooperators, the other for experts. So altogether, in terms of gender, we have more male respondents than female. And in terms of the age, as you see, we have quite important parts of the elderly people groups, like from 51 to 64, but also more than 65, etc. I think it's quite representing the current situation of the cooperative movement, which should be improved to have more younger generation. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay, then Alessandra, do you take?
Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so what did we find out through the survey? First of all, looking at what I'll call our foundational identity documents, so the statement on the cooperative identity and the guidance notes on the cooperative principles, we found that there is strong but not universal familiarity with these documents. Not too surprisingly, respondents are more familiar with the 7 cooperative principles than they are with the rest of the statement on the cooperative identity, so the definition and the values. And far fewer people were aware of the existence of the ICA guidance notes on the cooperative principles. Of those who were aware of the notes, many credit the notes with providing very helpful interpretation of the principles. Others comment, however, that the guidance notes, it's really a book, are too long and they're very detailed. And then there were other voices who took issue with different aspects of the notes. Next slide. So one of our questions was about the relevance to your cooperative business and the importance of each of the principles in distinguishing cooperatives from other forms of business enterprise. The importance of all of the principles was widely confirmed through the survey. There's no principle that anybody thinks is marginal or unimportant. Interestingly, respondents rated the democratic member control principle as the most relevant to their business or the most important in distinguishing cooperatives from other enterprise forms. But all the other principles were also considered rather relevant and important. And there was very little variation from one respondent type to another in answer to these questions. Next. Next slide. Sorry. Okay, now looking at the relevance to the business or the importance of each of the principles, there were 3 main views expressed. Quite a lot of people said that the principles are an indivisible whole. Each principle is part of a holistic framework, and they need to be taken together. Opinion was completely divided on the question of whether the principles should change or not. Some people thought that some fine-tuning would be in order, that the principles in one way or another should be updated, that there are areas that the principles don't address that should be covered. Just as many people think that the principles should not be changed. Next slide. Now, most people agree first that the statement on the cooperative identity has an impact on their cooperative. And second, that the statement is relevant in expressing the distinct purpose and nature of cooperatives and also in capturing our responsibility to society at large and to future generations. Interestingly, expert respondents have a more idealized understanding of the relevance of the statement, but they hold a more critical view on how well we're living up to it. Next slide. Quite interesting is the fact that, with the exception of the expert respondents, most respondents were not prepared to agree strongly with statements that cooperatives are losing ground to other actors. So whenever the statements were expressed in the negative, people were inclined not to agree with them. All types of respondents believe that the statement has not been promoted sufficiently. Lots of comments were made to this effect, and looking also at the rating that people gave to the statements, we see that people think there's a lot of room to promote the statement more widely, particularly among government actors. But there's also a sense that more internal education needs to happen within our movement on the cooperative identity. Next. Over to you, Hong-Sik.
Okay. So we also try to analyze the survey result with countries, because we have the 19 countries from which there are more than 30 responses, means that quite a significant number of the responses. So we analyze these countries and the rest. So we found there is very interesting point that the contrasting views emerged on the issue of whether cooperatives are losing ground to other actors or not, particularly in the area of the environmental responsibility or other social issues. So on that point, next slide, we found three different trends among different countries. First group of countries saying that they don't agree with this statement. We are not losing the ground. We are still good to maintain the field in these areas, like Nigeria, Philippines, Korea, Argentina, Finland. The respondent from these countries saying we are good to keeping these areas. And another group is in the middle position. They say it's more or less good. They are still good keeping this area, like the Brazil, Spain, India, Kenya, France, and Greece and Colombia to some extent. And there are some countries where the respondents feel that we are quite losing the ground, and already threatened by different other actors like competitors, like some countries like USA, Canada, Australia, UK, etc. So I think this we need to understand the cultural difference, also the national context, which have different position of the cooperative movement vis-a-vis other actors, and also many social issues. One interesting point was that some countries expressed, like Korea, Spain, US, Australia, express more stronger agreement about the impact of a statement than relevance. It means they see the cooperatives and the statement in a more practical perspective than ideological perspective. This is also very interesting, the finding which show the different cultural understanding on cooperative model. Next slide. And after analyzing all these answers with the statistical operation, we also try to analyze the comments respondents provide through the comments box, which are very huge amount of the comments we received. So next slide. So we try to just check some interesting point. First of all, some comments about the relevance of the identity statement. We found three different views have been expressed. First of all, the current identity statement work well as an idea and also in reality. So in the different field, the cooperative identity statement help cooperative movement to pursuing social role and its own the on the mission, etc., etc. So this very positive position they expressed vis-a-vis the identity statement. And next one, next slide. But there is another approach that people say the identity statement is work very well as an idea, but there is a gap between the idea and the reality on the ground. And also the statement need to be better promoted, disseminated, and also more educated in the different field. And also it should be operationalized through several tools. People responded proposed some interesting tools like cooperative social balance sheet used in Latin American countries, mutual value measurement tool developed in Australia, etc. Other tools need to be developed further to really implement the statement not only as idea but also in reality. But third, the perspective saying that the statement is not effective in itself and may not work well in practice neither. So we can see from the comments there are different views. It's important to emphasize that it's not important to say how much different view expressed with a different number of comments. It's not important, but we need to see there are differences in opinion of the respondent, and it should need to be considered. And next, Alessandra.
Yes, okay, so looking at the impact of the identity statement on cooperatives. So what is covered under this? First, there were statements in the survey that we asked people to affirm their agreement or disagreement with concerning the competitive advantage that our cooperative identity offers us and the difference that our cooperative identity makes to vis-a-vis the success of our business. There were statements concerning the extent to which cooperatives operate, that the respondents are familiar with, operate in full accordance with the values and the principles. And another statement about marketing the cooperative difference. So these four statements together, we've grouped under the heading of impact of the identity statement on cooperatives. Next slide, please. A full range of views was expressed, not surprisingly. So some people thought yes, across the board. Others said yes, provided that the principles are applied properly. Others said yes, but something else needs to be done. And others were divided and said, well, yes to some statements, no to other statements. So yes, to some extent. And then there were others who thought no. So for instance, no, our cooperative identity does not provide a competitive advantage, or no, we aren't marketing our cooperative difference. Next slide, please. Okay, looking at the question of whether cooperatives are losing ground to other actors. Now, we're not talking here about losing business to other actors. We're talking about our responsibility to society at large. Again, views, judging from the comments, are very much divided on this question. So some respondents thought, yeah, they were in agreement, we are losing ground. Others think we're losing ground in some areas, but not in others. Yet others think that, no, we're fine when we fully apply our values and principles. Others thought, no, we're not losing ground, but we need to do a lot more as cooperatives. A couple of other points were made. A number of respondents said, you know, this is not a competition. It doesn't matter whether we're ahead or behind other actors. We need to be prepared to work with all other actors in pursuing the public interest in addressing the problems of society today. Other respondents were quite concerned to say, we have a place, but it's not the place, it's not our place to do what should be done by government or by social service providers. So quite an interesting range of views expressed on this broad question. Next slide. Okay, so summing up, what are the main findings so far from the survey? And I want to emphasize here Martin's point that we've just begun really to look carefully at the survey results. There'll be a lot more to say later. Next slide, please. There are essentially 4 different positions concerning the current identity statement, you know, and they really capture all the logical alternatives. Lots of people think the current statement is good or good enough. Others think that the statement needs to be updated to strengthen the contribution of cooperatives to addressing societal problems and the environmental crisis facing the world. Others think that a more balanced approach is needed to fulfill the original mission of cooperatives. And then finally, and it's a strong statement, but it was interesting to see that there were quite a few comments of this nature. Some think this statement is essentially hypocritical, and I'll elaborate a bit on each of these. Next slide, please. Okay, current statement's good enough, think many people, but we need to fully practice the cooperative principles. We need to make sure that the statement becomes better known, and as was suggested earlier, we need tools to help cooperatives fully live their cooperative identity. Next. Okay, those who think that the current statement needs to be updated say that we need to catch up to a changing world. The main areas that people identified as not addressed through our principles or not adequately addressed are environmental sustainability, treatment of employees, diversity, and inclusion. So such things as gender, race, ethnicity, different age groups, and so on. Now, lots of people think that the statement needs to be more specific in different ways, and they need to provide more practical advice. Just as many probably think that the statement needs to be high level, it needs to be general, it needs to be universal in its application. So we'll see how we square that circle later. And interestingly, many commented that the language of the statement could be more concise, it could be plainer and easier for people to understand. Next. Those who advocated taking a more balanced approach to ensure that we achieve the original mission of cooperatives were asking for balance in 2 areas. First, between the economic and the social dimensions of the cooperative. And second, between the interests of members of the cooperative and the interests of the community at large, or we could say the public interest. There's definitely a current of opinion that says the role of cooperatives is to advance economic equality or economic justice, and the responsibility for other societal problems, so for example, diversity and inclusion, belongs with other actors. Next slide. Okay. Those who think that the statement is hypocritical are suggesting that we don't live up to the values and the principles. We use them only as a marketing tool. Some people don't like the normative quality of the statement and say, you know, why try to dictate to others, or who can judge what is a true cooperative and what is a false cooperative. The observation was made that the UN Social Development Goals are unrealistic. Others pointed out that, or argued that members and employees are not interested in the cooperative identity. And others, again, say, yeah, we're proud of being a cooperative, but it's not because of our cooperative identity. We're proud for other good reasons. Next slide. Broadly speaking, we can identify 4 contrasting dynamics. So we have a current of opinion that says we need to stop seeing cooperatives as a business model that business success and cooperative success should be distinguished from each other. Next. We have another current of opinion that says that cooperativism is a specific form of movement based on members' economic participation. Next. Others say the business side needs to be strengthened, or they say that the cooperative identity can limit cooperatives in terms of their business success. And then finally, next slide. We have those who believe that the current compromise needs to be maintained and that more promotion of our identity and more effective implementation is needed. Now, what do we mean by this compromise? So it can be fairly argued that the current statement on the cooperative identity is in itself a compromise between those who would place the emphasis on the social role of cooperatives and those who would place the emphasis on the economic role of cooperatives. So I hope you can see from this that there's quite an array of views, expressed by the respondents to the survey. Next. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation of the survey results. I'll remind participants again that you're free to ask questions about the survey, anything you want to ask about the survey results. And we're going to have a Q&A session a little further on in this webinar, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. And now we're going to go to panel discussion. So I'm going to ask that we take down the presentation for the moment. And okay, very good. And I'm going to introduce our panel. So we have 4 people participating in the panel from different parts of the world. First of all, Urban Crowell. Urban is the executive director of the Neighboring Food Co-op Association in the United States. He serves on the board of directors of the National Cooperative Business Association and also DOT Co-op and the Cooperative Management Education Cooperative. He's a member of the ICA Cooperative Identity Advisory Group. We have David Rogers with us. He's the former chief executive of England's largest cooperative housing association. He's the former president of Cooperative Housing International. And David served as the interpretive editor of the ICA's 2015 guidance notes on the cooperative principles. So we have an expert on the notes with us. Melina Morrison is joining our panel. And just so you all know, it's 1:30 in the morning in Australia. So we're very, very happy that Melina was prepared to make herself available. She's the CEO of the apex body for cooperatives and mutuals in Australia. And together, the cooperative mutual sectors in Australia boast 8 in every 10 Australians as members. We have with us from Kenya, we have Esther Cheru, and Esther is Deputy Vice Chancellor in charge of Finance, Planning and Administration at the Cooperative University of Kenya. And she's worked at the university in various positions since 1988. And before that, she worked with the Ministry of Cooperative Development in Kenya. So welcome to our panelists. I'm going to play the role of moderator. And so I'm going to open up with a question on this issue of, is it proper to see a cooperative as a business? So in commenting on the definition of a cooperative, that part of the identity statement, some survey respondents take issue with characterizing a cooperative as an enterprise or a business. They argue that this overlooks the social purpose of a cooperative and is evidence that cooperatives have become captive to prevailing capitalist ideology. However, others point to the fact that a cooperative is a business with a social purpose, and they mention the nuances in the definition, noting that persons comes first and enterprise is mentioned at the end. One respondent noted that a cooperative business is an enabling foundation that keeps people in mind first, or puts them on top. Esther, can you tell us where you stand on this issue?
Okay, thank you very much for the question and even the presentation, which has summarized well the result of the survey. Now, as far as whether cooperatives are adopting more capitalistic tendencies because of the fact that we are identifying them as business or enterprise organizations, I think in my case, I think cooperatives both socio, they have a social purpose and they also have an economic purpose. And therefore,
Okay, Esther seems to be frozen. Or perhaps the problem is at my end. All right, that wasn't in the scenario for our panel discussion. So what I'll do is I'm going to turn it over to you, David, if you don't mind, because I think your views are probably well aligned with Esther's. Do you want to say a few words? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, on the first question. Yeah, I mean, I think that the debate about whether cooperatives are a business or not is really a false dichotomy. I mean, there are two clearly complementary aspects of a cooperative identity. The first is that a cooperative is an association of persons. It's very fundamentally people-based. And as the statement says, united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations. And that defines the fundamental nature of what the purpose of a cooperative is. But then the cooperative identity statement then goes on and says that the way that objective is achieved is through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. So you've got two dimensions to the nature of a cooperative, and they're complementary. Also, a cooperative may operate more than one business. I mean, for example, in the UK, our cooperative group, which is a large consumer retail food cooperative, also operates a funeral business. It owns a factory for manufacturing coffins. It used to own a bank and an insurance company, although it sold those, and a travel business. So you can have one cooperative operating more than one cooperative enterprise. And this shows the dual nature of it. And I think it's worth remembering that this dual nature was evident right from the very founding of the cooperative movement. If you look at the first law of the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers, it states the objectives, which are to improve the social and domestic condition of its members. That was its objective. And it then goes and actually lists the way in which the Rochdale Pioneers intended to do that. And they say, this will actually be done, if you look at their list, through a number of enterprises. A store for the sale of provisions, building of houses, manufacturing enterprise, a self-sufficient cooperative village or colony. And indeed, for some of us, which might be rather alarming, a temperance hotel, which I think was dropped by the cooperative movement fairly rapidly. But, this shows the dual dimension of the nature of a cooperative. It has a very distinct social, cultural, and economic purpose, and it achieves that through running efficient business enterprise based on our principles and values.
Thank you, David. I'll go on to the next question. I note that Esther is back with us. I'll come to you later, Esther. Cooperatives share characteristics with corporations of all kinds. So perpetual succession, limited liability, the power to own property, entering into contracts, and so on. They operate businesses in the same fields as investor-owned joint stock companies, and they hold values in common with many not-for-profit organizations. For example, solidarity, social responsibility, caring for others. The purpose of the statement on the cooperative identity is to identify the enduring characteristics that set cooperatives apart from other forms of enterprise. How well does the statement do this, in your view? Urban.
Thank you, Alexandra. First, I just want to say what an important and valuable conversation I think this is, and thank you for your work, as well as the ICA staff and committee members for bringing this all together. I personally feel like this discussion points to what is most compelling about our movement, that we're even having a dialogue on how best to even describe what we are, what our values are and principles, just points to the openness and dynamism of our movement. Now, that said, from my point of view, when read closely, I think that the current statement taken as a whole does an excellent job of communicating what makes our model unique. I think a core challenge is that even though one of our basic principles is education, engaging our members, staff, policymakers, activists in the identity and how it's articulated, is actually one of the most neglected. I think, as you pointed out, while most survey respondents stated a familiarity with the principles, they also said they're not as familiar with the values or the identity as a whole, and much less with the guidance notes, which, if you read those closely, attempt to further articulate the relevance of the principles to contemporary issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion, climate change, economic inequality. It's a live conversation among an international movement that I think is very powerful. In my own experience, I have to admit, it was a revelation for me when I first learned about the cooperative values, and this was after almost a decade of working in a worker cooperative. And it came about when I started the Master Management Program in Co-ops and Credit Unions at St. Mary's University, and the first thing they did was quiz students on the values, and I was completely stumped. But that process led to just being really inspired and learning how to not only understand how those values and principles had evolved over time in response to what was going on around us, but also how to put them into action in the operation of our enterprises. And as David's pointing out, to me, one of the most valuable things about our movement is that tension between the social and economic purposes. It's not an either or, that's where the action is from my point of view. So when we look at the statement closely, when we think about these shared values and principles, I think it serves us very well in communicating our difference. And just as importantly, I think it does it in a clear and broad manner that's enabled an incredible diversity of people from across nations, sectors, and communities to see a common purpose, to see a shared vision of the future in a way that defines an international movement. And so looking forward, I think this is a crucial dialogue, and we really need to dig into how relevant, how fit for purpose the identity is to these current challenges and opportunities. And I also think a central task in that process is ensuring that we do it in a way that can continue to unite a very diverse international movement in a way that enables us to offer a viable, impactful, and inspiring alternative to people at a critical time in our history. So I think, that's my core message. And I guess where I would leave that is just, looking at the history of our movement and how it has evolved and responded to change is a very good roadmap for us to think about the future.
Indeed, it is a critical time in the world. Melina, I would ask you, do you think that the identity statement speaks clearly to contemporary societal concerns, such as the state of the natural environment, the need for good labor relations, and diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how do you think the statement stands up against other efforts to express the social impact of business, such as B corporations and the advent of ESG, environmental, social, and governance concerns? Do you think we're in danger of being overtaken, as some of the survey respondents suggest?
Well, thank you, Alexandra. I'll respond to the first part of the question first, before thinking about whether we're in danger of being sort of superseded by other stronger marketing campaigns or messages. I suppose the thing that's really stood out for me listening to Urban just then is the power of language. And I think when we hear the words values and principles, we think about this in language terms as beliefs. But in fact, the principles are more than beliefs. They're not vague or mutable. They're guiding rules and characteristics for our businesses, our governance, and in fact, our legal and constitutional documents. And they're immutable in that way. So they're part of our DNA. So my view is that they are remarkably modern, and they're remarkable for their modernity, considering how long ago the core characteristics were established. If you think of the foundations of the movement with the pioneers. So I think they do stand up to addressing modern crises and issues very well. They've stood the test of time. And we can see that because they speak to global trends that are now being expressed as business as usual in movements like ESG, environment and social governance, that all businesses are being asked to address. If we look at principles like open and voluntary membership, we see the ideas of inclusivity and diversity that are now becoming business as usual principles, the ideas of economic democracy that we established many centuries ago, in fact, and care for the community. And if we look around at other forms of business, these are expressed in movements like stakeholder capitalism, shared value, the idea of you needing a social license to operate, and even the Sustainable Development Goals are an attempt by the United Nations to say that, you know, in order for there to be human prosperity, all economic and social activity has to address humanistic goals. So that's why we can say we are the original ESG businesses. Hand on heart, we can say that. So our job is actually to bring those principles to life through clear, consistent communication. And this is where we do have some danger, because we're not good at expressing how our principles speak to current issues, how in fact in a crisis, business purpose really matters. And so if we can live our values and principles, and this did come out of the survey in a lot of comments, if we can live them and engage with the fundamental ideas underlying those principles, such as member engagement, then we're going to be able to compete and keep a competitive advantage in a world where we can now distinguish our business model on its social impact, which is where the whole business trend is going.
Thank you, Melina. You know, I was very struck by the analysis that revealed that this concern about whether we're losing ground as cooperatives to other actors is very strong, or stronger, is a better way to put it, in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan. But that block of Anglo countries, that caught my attention. If you look at the history of the modern corporation, business corporation, it was invented actually at about the same time as cooperatives in the middle of the 19th century, the essential features that we see today. And cooperatives were formed very much in opposition to typical business ventures, out of a sense that they were not meeting the needs. They were systematically disadvantaging ordinary working people. Today, we worry about being overtaken by that very same sector. At the same time as we worry about isomorphism, about cooperatives assuming too many of the characteristics of traditional joint stock companies. So it's a very interesting situation. But I want to ask you, Esther, from a developing economy vantage point, is this a concern? Do cooperatives in your part of the world feel that they are at risk of losing this social ground, I'll put it that way, to investor-owned businesses?
Okay, thank you. And sorry, I stepped out. I think I have a weak network, but I have changed the gadget, so I hope this one will work better. Yeah, so I think just like I was saying, cooperatives have both socio and economic purpose. And because of that, we need to see how we can balance the two. If we were to talk about cooperatives just being identified as socio entities, we are likely to lose membership because members will identify them as just socio entities, and they'll not look at the business part of it as beneficial to them. So it's very important that we balance the two. And in my country, for example, I find that since we introduced the word enterprise, and the business connotation in the cooperative ideals, it has been adopted better. I know in all our cooperative legal frameworks, we have introduced the statement of the cooperative identity and captured the statement and also the values and principles. And when we have introduced the business entity, people tend to be happier because they know that they are going to make surpluses. We can still call it profit, although cooperatives are not profit oriented, they are more people oriented. But at the same time, people need to, they need to have surplus so that they can be able to support themselves in what they are doing. So when you look at the practical part of it, it is important for us also to emphasize on the business, because that's the only way people will be happy that they are able to support their undertakings through cooperatives, through funding through funding themselves through the cooperatives. So for me, my studies that we need to emphasize the business and entrepreneurial, entrepreneurial activity for cooperatives, because without that, then they'll just be like any other society, society organizations which are registered through maybe the registrar of societies, and those ones, they don't really have a legal entity as such. So I would really think that in my country, when we have put the business and enterprise part of it, it works better. Now, the only thing here also again is that you find that because of now that entrepreneurial and business kind of orientation, there are some cooperatives also which now lose their meaning, and they start chasing, chasing money, chasing profit. They may not be all, but the fact that now there is that emphasis on business, there are some which has taken the wrong route, and they start now thinking that they have to, to make money just like any other financial institutions, especially for the financial cooperatives. So they start thinking that they can also make money like other financial institutions, and you find them now losing the core purpose. Yeah, instead of having cooperatives rooted in their communities as the basic membership unit, you find them spreading all over. Like you have a cooperative which may bank or a front office service, and then they start opening everywhere across the country. And they have no relationship with some of the communities where they open, those banks. And that way, now you find they are losing the meaning. But that one requires a lot of education. With education, they can come back on track. But my start would be that we need to emphasize the business and enterprise part of the cooperative business model.
Thank you. So really, Esther, you're arguing, I think, for a balance between the economic purpose of the cooperative and the social purpose. And you've nicely illustrated the risk associated with emphasizing the economic aspects at the expense of the social aspects. I want to go on now to look at this very interesting point that was raised through the survey by a number of respondents respecting whether or not the identity statement fully captures the responsibility of cooperatives to future generations. So their opinion was divided. Some people, quite a few people, observed that the concept of stewardship is implicit in the statement, while others argued that it's not in the statement, or maybe it's there implicitly, but it needs to be drawn out explicitly. So I'd like to turn to you, David, for your views on that question. You need to unmute.
Yes, I was very interested to see that the results of the survey respondents actually said that they felt that the statement does capture the responsibility to future generations. But I think it's true to say that that is actually implicit, more than explicit, in the 7 principles. I think where it is captured is in the concept of sustainable development in Principle 7. Now that concept, I think you need to look where that came from. It comes from the Brundtland report to the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio. And since 1997, that concept of sustainable development, which includes concern for social purpose, for social outcomes, for the environment, for stewardship of assets and for future generations, that is all encapsulated in that concept of sustainable development. And it follows through to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are not just about the existing generations. It is about sustaining the world for the future and for our children and for our grandchildren. So I think it is really, it is there. It is in that concept of sustainable development. And it is in that sense, not spelt out, it is implicit rather than explicit. Now, if you were to write the statement of identity today, you would make it explicit. There is absolutely no doubt. But I think you need to recognize that there are inherent difficulties in amending the statement of identity and the cooperative principles and values, because they are written into international law. Sustainable development is written into international law. It's recognized by the International Court of Justice as a concept in public international law. And it clearly includes future generation and the protection of the environment. But if you look at the statement of cooperative identity and values and principles, that too is written into international law. It's in the UN Declaration on Cooperatives, and very particularly in ILO Recommendation 193. And it's written into cooperative legislation in many different countries. So, it is actually quite difficult to tinker with the statement and with the principles. And I mean, having said that, I think it goes back to the question. I think, Urban, you raised this very, very clearly in your experience. I think what is really important is Principle 5. It's about education, training, and indeed, dare I say, from my own perspective, the guidance notes, because we do set this out very, very clearly in the guidance notes. You know, we do need to educate people. We need to educate people to understand that that concept of sustainable development is all encompassing. And it does include the environment and future generations. And it perhaps education rather than tinkering and making things explicit that are implicit that we need to focus on.
Thank you. I'm going to put my last question to you, Urban, and then we'll take some time to look at the questions that our audience has posed. So it's very interesting to see that all types of respondents as a group, each group of respondents, I should say, rated democratic member control as the principle among the 7 that is most important in distinguishing cooperatives from other forms of enterprise. Now, there are, I'm going to suggest in many jurisdictions, encroachments on member control of cooperatives. So this has taken the form of legislation in some cases, or government regulation, for example, very much in the banking sector. When we grant partial control to government or to external investors or other parties, it weakens member control and it risks undermining the purpose of the cooperative altogether. A current example under discussion is the Uniform Limited Cooperative Association Act in the United States, which allows cooperatives to treat external investors, who are not users of the cooperative services, as members, and it allows them to grant voting rights to capital. Can you comment briefly, Urban, on this phenomenon and its implications for the cooperative identity?
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra. You know, ironically, I think it's because of the historical success and impact of the cooperative model that we often see initiatives like this that attempt to use the co-op name for enterprises or organizations that don't necessarily accurately reflect our values and principles. The irony is that in doing so, I think it actually undermines what makes co-ops as effective as they are. It's also why our movement has advocated for laws over time that specifically state that a business that's not incorporated as a co-op can't market itself as a cooperative, right? So I was also very encouraged to see in the survey responses a concern that the identity is not sufficiently promoted, particularly in terms of government actors, their awareness and education around the cooperative principles. Now, since the founding of the movement, when we were first able to press for legal recognition in the 1800s, right before that, there was not even legal recognition of the model. We've faced this challenge of ensuring that the laws put in place actually stay true to the principles, because in the absence of clear advocacy by our movement, the principles are often displaced either by other interests or simply assumptions that come out of a misunderstanding of the principles, and they get replaced by assumptions that come from the mainstream business world or from the state or from other interests. So whether we're talking about the influence of investors, which led to the inclusion of limited interest on capital in the 1937 version of the Rochdale Principles, or the interference of state interests, which led to an emphasis on voluntary membership in the 1996 version, or more recently, the influence of external organizations, whether they might be NGOs or nonprofits, over the members as users of the enterprise and participants. This question has come up repeatedly over time. And since its founding, the ICA has worked to ensure that principles are recognized by governments through efforts with the United Nations, with International Labor Organization, with other actors. But the challenge is that co-op laws generally developed and implemented at the national or even the state level. And when those laws are put in place by legislators that are unfamiliar with the principles, or in the absence of input by the ICA or national associations or even state associations, the very definition of what a cooperative is threatened. And personally, I think that's probably the most urgent challenge to the cooperative identity, because it has the potential to fundamentally change what it means to be a cooperative and in that process to influence public perception of co-ops and how they operate and to the degree to which they are following their own values and principles. So the Uniform Limited Cooperative Association Act is just one example that I think is worthy of analysis as we seek to ensure that co-ops are relevant. You know, they're able to meet people's needs, they're able to access capital without giving up control by member users. But I think it's just one example. And I think the real challenge for our movement is how we can work together to better understand the appropriate application of principles to the laws that regulate co-ops, credit unions, mutuals. And this is also where I think this dialogue is, again, so valuable. The work of the ICA and the Cooperative Law Committee are really important assets for our movement and examples of the importance of Principle 6, you know, as co-ops working together through federations and associations to protect our shared interests and promote the cooperative legal identity as we move forward, so that all of these values and principles that we are debating and discussing and ensuring are actually relevant to our needs today are accurately implemented at the state legal level. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on now to some questions from our audience. Now, we've got a lot of questions today. They cover a very wide terrain, so I'm just going to pick a handful. But I'm going to start with a question for you, Hungsik. One of our participants asks whether we can analyze the survey results by region and by sector. Now, I know that you have done a statistical analysis to try to see whether where there are correlations between certain types of respondents and certain views expressed. Can you tell us? You gave us the example of differences by country. Did you see any other striking differences? And did you were you able to explore? Maybe you've still got more work to do, but were you able to explore the different demographic characteristics of our respondents and whether there were different views showing up for the different groups?
Yeah. So I also see some questions related to that issue. Also, some other dimension they wanted to know more about through this survey. First of all, I would say that this survey was designed for a specific purpose, so you cannot answer all your questions because you can say something, but it's not really sure because it's just the secondary output we can just feel, not we can get with evidence. So, but I think your questions are very helpful to feed our discussion further. But unfortunately, we could not answer all these questions, which is not really directly related to our survey. And concerning the variables like the country, region, and gender, other issues, we already analyzed the relationship between these variables with the answers. We found that there are several interesting points, but which it does not necessarily show interesting finding, but it's more sociological findings. Something like when you analyze male respondent and also the elderly people, also those who have longer experience in cooperative movement, have a tendency saying more strongly. They express more strongly because it's more cultural issue. I don't think that makes some differences in the meaning of our discussion, but we need to consider this kind of the differences according to different variables. Also, we can try to catch some interesting point like we had with the country analysis, because different countries show different understanding or different impression. Some sectors, yes, but we will include these findings in the final report. But I would say this is not our purpose. So it can be interesting point, but it cannot be a very solid argument we can deliver from this survey.
Thank you. Quite a few questions concern the place of workers or employees. And so our participants ask whether the identity statement speaks in any way to the issue of decent work or fair treatment of employees. So I'll ask you, Melina, whether you have any thoughts on this question.
Well, I think it's again it's talking back to how well we live our values and principles in terms of where, you know, the modern business corporation is going in general. The need to count all stakeholders as being equally benefiting from and contributing to the sustainable outcomes of the enterprise and therefore the wider society is critical. I mean, in a worker cooperative, the most enlightened form of business that is worker controlled and owned is a worker cooperative. There doesn't seem to be another type of enterprise that places workers, you know, at the pinnacle of the business. So in that sense, it's a very, you know, it's a very empowering structure. In living, if workers are not members of the cooperative, then those other principles that speak to the social benefits and the social impact of the business should be speaking very strongly to the role of workers. In many ways, our competitive advantage is to show that we are the most strongly evolved form of stakeholder business, because this is what people want to see in business. They want to see this sort of form of ethical business. And again, I think this is our opportunity through clear communication to say how we enshrine that. We are also the only business model that has a role within the International Labour Organization that's defined, you know, as a branch of the ILO. And just thinking back to what David was saying about how important reading the guidance notes are, which are excellent. Indeed, also reading ILO recommendation 193 is critical, because in that quite succinct statement, we have what we need to do in terms of the legislative and regulatory environment to make sure that cooperatives are treated on a level playing field.
Thank you.
Alessandra, I just wanted to compliment this point, because I found in the comments many people raised the idea about the environment as the biggest voice as concerning the new idea to be included. But the second place was actually about this issue, the place of the employees in the cooperatives. It was very striking for me, because historically the cooperative movement have this discussion since its creation of the ICA. When we examine the historical document, actually one of the first debate was in the Congress was about the place of the employee of cooperatives. So I think it raised several times during more than 100 years. Again, I think this is still a very important issue. We might examine further in coming steps.
Thank you. We have a few questions that speak to the issue of so-called fake cooperatives, or I'll describe them as cooperatives of convenience. So cooperatives that have been formed for some purpose that we wouldn't recognize as the chief purpose for forming a cooperative, but who are using cooperative legislation. There were, of course, in the survey, there were different views on this subject. Some people commented that, look, if there's cooperative legislation and you can jump through the hoops in that legislation and qualify to incorporate as a cooperative, you are a cooperative, and we shouldn't we shouldn't try to judge afterwards whether you're a true cooperative, a good cooperative, a bad cooperative. Equally, we have people saying there needs to be some kind of, there need to be some standards. There could be an international standard of some kind, something that we can measure individual cooperatives against to determine whether they're genuine, whether fully cooperatives or not. One of our participants expresses concern about wind turbine cooperatives in Belgium. I doubt that any of our panelists is adequately informed about what's going on with wind turbines in Belgium to speak to that specific point. But I did want to ask our panel what your view is on this question of true or fake cooperatives. I'll turn it over to you, Urban, to answer.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think it's a tricky question to me, because I'm not sure that we're necessarily asking the right question, because I think, as we were discussing, when a law gets put in place describing a certain type of entity, but it doesn't reflect the principles that describe cooperative operation, which prevails? Are we saying that the law that's not actually based on the principles prevails just because the word cooperative was used? Or do the principles prevail? I would argue, if we intend to be a movement, if we intend to be a values-based, people-centered movement, we need to argue that it's the principles that prevail, and we need to make our case to government entities toward that end and help them understand why that is important. One of the reasons that I do think that this is very important for cooperatives is that in various jurisdictions, right, cooperatives enjoy certain benefits related to the fact that they operate in a cooperative manner, right? And people are used to certain types of cooperatives are used to certain benefits, whether they are tax benefits, government support, other types of benefits related to the fact that they are member-owned by their users, they're democratically governed, and they're not profit maximizing organizations, right? So what happens if a government creates a statute that undermines that and allows an entity that is profit maximizing or profit seeking and calls itself a co-op? Is there potential there that the rest of the movement's benefits or its treatment by governments is put at risk? I would argue that it is, in fact, putting at risk the entire movement and its ability to articulate a people, values, and principles-based alternative. And if we don't take that seriously, it will be on us to see the alternative that we offer to people be diminished and potentially become irrelevant, because people will not be able to see what it is that actually makes us different anymore. So I guess I would push back on the argument a little bit and say that we need to take this seriously and really think about how the identity is reflected in the statutes that regulate our operation.
Now, it turns out that David does know something about wind turbines in Belgium, so I'll invite you to speak now.
Not quite wind turbines in Belgium, actually wind turbines on the Isle of Wight. We had a renewable energy cooperative seek to register a wind farm and a solar farm on the Isle of Wight, and our regulator, which is the Financial Conduct Authority here, initially refused to register them because they said it was a false cooperative, in that the incentive for people to become a member was a return on the capital that was required. Now, unfortunately, go back to what Melina said about the importance of ILO Recommendation 193. ILO Recommendation 193 does actually require national governments to incorporate into their national legislation the Statement of Identity and the 7 cooperative values and the cooperative values and 7 principles. Ours doesn't as yet. We're still working on that. But the regulator said, well, this is actually a false co-op because of the people are seeking a return on investment. Yet without a return on investment, you will never set up a wind turbine or a renewable energy co-op. And I was asked to advise on that issue, which I did. And the advice I gave was that it should comply with the cooperative principles, that the return on capital and the guidance notes, which the return on capital should be the minimum required to raise the funds that are necessary to deliver this type of cooperative enterprise. And you should absolutely ensure that everybody who invests signs up to the cooperative values and principles and actually state very clearly that their investment is to achieve their own cultural and environmental objectives, which is to assist in combating climate change. And eventually those arguments were accepted by the regulator, but it would have been much easier if we'd have had the ILO recommendation written into law.
Thank you, David. I'm going to put one last question to our panel, and it's a big one. So I'll ask Esther to speak to it. We're running close now to the scheduled end of this event. So here we go. Can cooperatives successfully practice social transformation in a capitalist environment? What's your view, Esther? Now, you're off camera and your mic is off, but I'm assuming you're still with us. Yep, you're back on camera. Excellent. And you need to unmute.
Okay, thank
you. You muted again, I think. Yeah. So go ahead.
Yes, so the question is whether cooperatives can succeed in the social transformation
in a capitalist environment. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so what I would say is that the cooperatives, through the cooperative identity, this is what unites us as members of cooperatives. And we are united to work for our common good. And if we are united to work for our common good through our values and the principles, many of us and many millions of people who are members of cooperatives have the opportunity to control their own destiny. In other words, they are able to identify what their needs are and what their needs even in the future are. And this would now help them to see how they move from where they are to their needs even in the future. And because of that, it is possible for cooperatives to cause transformation of its own members. If we look at the 7th cooperative principle, we find that this principle combines two elements of the cooperative values. That is the values of self-help and self-responsibility. And that one is very critical for transformation, because when people come together and they pool their resources and then they take responsibility of what they want to do, it is very easy to cause transformation. We also have the ethical values of honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others. The cooperative principle number 7, which is also a concern for community. So if you look at these values and when they are intertwined and addressed through the 7th principle, these are the same values that are addressing people's right, what people would like to see about their lives, and therefore they just need to seriously apply them, because what is the problem sometimes is the fact that we do not apply the principles as they are supposed to be. But if we were to apply them as they are supposed to be, if you look at all the principles from number 1 even up to 7, and they are applied the way they are supposed to be, they will definitely cause transformation. the major problem that we have had is the lack of understanding sometimes of these principles. And that's why I was saying that education and training need to be emphasized so that these principles are not just rhetorics, but they are understood. And if they are understood, they are going to be applied practically. And if we apply them the way they are supposed to work, definitely they are going to cause transformation of our societies. And I think that is where we are. When you talked earlier on, you talked about the guidelines. And I know the survey respondents also commented that the guidelines are too detailed and it may be even somehow complicated. So that's another area we can look at, so that if the guidelines to apply the principles are more clearer and more simplified, not too lengthy, because when they are too lengthy, you read how to apply one principle. Before you go to the next one, it is a very long text that you have read. But if they are well, well documented in a simple language and in a short form, all these principles applied practically will cause transformation of our societies.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther. I'll have to cut you off, unfortunately, because we've got just a couple of minutes left in this seminar, but I think that's an excellent note to end our session on, because this question of the need to promote our identity, to understand it better ourselves, to make sure that cooperative members and managers understand it, came through loudly and clearly in the survey. So, okay, if we can just put the final slide of the presentation up, please. I'll just take a few moments to go over what's coming next in the Cooperative Identity Consultation. Somebody out there is managing the slides. We just need the last one. There we go. Okay, so what you have here is kind of a timeline. You can see that we kicked off the whole process in 2021 with the 33rd World Cooperative Congress, which is focused on the cooperative identity. We did the survey over an extended period in 2022. Today, we've given you a first glimpse, that's the way I'm going to put it, of the survey results. You can expect to hear more. There'll be a little paper issued that will summarize the survey results. And so what's coming next? We're going to unveil an online discussion platform that we've developed. One of our very generous volunteers has developed it for us. So that's going to happen early in the new year. And that will permit people to have an online discussion about the kinds of issues we've been talking about today and other issues related to the identity. Simultaneous with that, over the early part of 2023, we'll be launching virtual consultations, and these can happen on a national basis or broader regional basis or local basis. We'll be inviting the sectoral bodies to have consultations and the thematic committees to have consultations. So that's all coming. And that's really going to take place throughout 2023. Then the advisory group is going to try to digest what's being said through the consultation process, and deliberate on the question, is the statement still fit for purpose? It will give its advice to the ICA Board of Directors. The Board of Directors will report to the members if any changes are proposed, and that's an if. Then the members through 2 general assemblies would need to approve those changes. So that could take us all the way out to 2025. So that's the process in summary. It's 10:30. So we're going to say that our webinar today is done. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope that you'll tune in for future events. Thank you.